Switchback, a Patrick Flint novel. Written by Pamela Fagan Hutchins. Copyright 2019. Narrated by Pamela Fagan Hutchins. Copyright 2019. Chapter 1. Forward. Buffalo, Wyoming, September 18th, 1976, 2 a.m. Patrick. If there's one thing he'd learned working the emergency room at the Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas as a med student, it's that nothing good happens after midnight. Maybe in the sleepy town of Buffalo, Wyoming, he didn't get the prostitutes with fractured jaws, overdosed teenagers, gangbangers with lead between the eyes, or sex adventurers reluctant to explain the gerbils stuffed in their posteriors. But still, when the phone rang at 2 in the morning, Patrick knew it would be bad. He rolled over and jostled his wife, who was unseasonably buried under layers of blankets that he'd kicked off himself in the night. "Suzanne, I've got to go in." "Be careful." Her mumble was on autopilot, the same words she always said, and he was certain she didn't break out of REM sleep. "Suzanne, Suzanne." "What is it?" She jerked to a sitting position, looking wide-eyed, wild-haired, and suspicious in the meager moonlight streaming in the window, but still so damn beautiful. His heart did a somersault. The same woman he'd been in love with since he was a 15-year-old honor student at A&M Consolidated High School in College Station, Texas. He touched her cheek. "Everything's okay. I have to go into the hospital. Can you make sure everyone finishes packing in case I'm late getting back?" She slumped back onto her pillow. "Sure." "Thanks." He dressed in the near dark, in the clothes he'd left out the night before. He was the doc on call, after all. Before he left, he pressed his lips to Suzanne's temple. A contented sound interrupted her soft snores. Then he walked quickly from the upper-level main living area to the lower level, which was built into the side of a hill and mostly a basement, and out the front door to his car parked on the circle drive. With no garage, it was the same trek he made year-round. He moved stealthily, using the Indian fox-walking techniques he'd learned as a child in Boy Scouts. Crouch low with the hands on the knees, raise the foot high, set the outside of the foot down, roll to the inside, and put the heel down, toe down, and weight down. Repeat. If someone were to see him, he'd feel silly doing it, but he was alone, and it was good practice for his upcoming hunting trip. He was just passing his daughter Trish's room, and he sure didn't want to wake her. Lord save me from moody teenagers. Perry wasn't as bad at only 12, but his day would come. It would be bad enough when Patrick rousted his family at the crack of 9 to herd them into the truck and up the mountain. He shut the door of his white Porsche 914 as quietly as he could. Last night he'd parked in preparation for a quiet getaway, facing the car downhill and setting the emergency brake. Now he released the brake and let the sports car gather speed until he was nearly to the bottom of the driveway. As he made the roller coaster descent, he cranked the windows down. The only sound was wheels on dirt road. Then he popped the clutch, and the Porsche roared to life. The drive to the hospital usually only took 5 minutes, but they were always 5 minutes of white-knuckled terror. Suicidal deer and low-slung roadsters were a deadly combination, and the deer came out in full force at dusk, terrorizing the roads until nearly dawn. Suzanne had chewed him out and good for buying the Porsche. There were only 2 drivers in their family, she reminded him, and they already had 2 cars, her bronze station wagon and his old truck. It probably wasn't time yet to tell her that he had his eye on a Piper Super Cub airplane now that he had his pilot's license. But he loved the Porsche, and damn it, when a man married at 19, the only girl he'd ever dated, had a child at 20, and worked multiple jobs while studying medicine just to keep the wolves at bay, well, that man deserved a Porsche as soon as he could afford it. It wasn't that extravagant. He'd bought the cheapest version they made, but it still said Porsche on it like the fancier models, and the black hardtop could be removed to make it a convertible. He'd been proud of his frugality until he'd promptly spent the savings on special order parts and mechanics who only knew American cars and big trucks. As if it were reading his mind, the engine sputtered when he stopped at a traffic light. "That's it. This turd is going on the market." He mouthed the words to himself. Glancing sideways, he saw a bleary-eyed fellow driver staring at him from the next lane over. It was a teenage boy in a truck with the windows up. "What's the matter, buddy? Haven't you ever seen anyone talk to himself before?" He nodded. "At least I always know I'll get an intelligent response." The light turned green. Patrick gunned the engine. The Porsche roared forward, but the truck shot away ahead of it. The little sports car was more bark than bite. Loud, but with about the same acceleration he'd had in his old VW Bug. Driving along the quaint western Main Street with its dim streetlights, Patrick passed under bunting celebrating the bicentennial. Buffalo had taken the event to heart and had been observing it the entire year, and a few minutes later pulled into a spot reserved for the on-call doc outside the ER. Inside, a fluorescent light buzzed and blinked, giving the austere space a Twilight Zone feel. He hustled up to the X-ray tech, the one whose call had woken him. In most places, a duty nurse would have made the call. Most places didn't have Wes. "What have we got, Wes?" The tech stood a head taller than Patrick and weighed 50 pounds less. His blue scrubs didn't quite make it to his ankles. "Well, Doc, we've got a possible fractured leg." Wes said it matter-of-factly, but Patrick caught a twinkle in his eyes. What could possibly be funny about a broken leg at 2 a.m? "Where's the patient?" "Out in the parking lot, of course." Patrick had been walking toward the interior of the ER, but he stopped and faced Wes head-on. "Aren't we going to bring him in?" "Her. And no, I don't think that would be a good idea." "What's the problem?" "No problem." "What am I missing here?" He didn't usually have to drag answers out of Wes. Maybe the X-ray tech was sleepy, sluggish, like Patrick. "I'm not sure, Doc. Want me to come with you to see her?" Suddenly, Patrick was certain Wes was almost laughing. "Damn right I do." The two men walked out together and came upon a young man in dusty blue jeans, a threadbare Western shirt, and scuffed boots. He was standing at the edge of the parking lot, and he whipped off his hat when he saw them. "Thank you so much for coming in." The hand that reached for Patrick's was calloused and rough like sandpaper, its squeeze bone-crushing. "I'm Tater Nelson." "Dr. Flint. I hear we've got a possible leg fracture." "Yes, sir." "What's the patient's name?" "Mildred." "Mildred, okay." He followed Tater into the parking lot, where they stopped at a 2-horse trailer. Tater swung the rear door open. "You've got her in here?" "I didn't want her to spook in the parking lot and hurt herself worse." Patrick peered into the trailer. A hoof lashed out, short of him by 6 inches. He jumped back 2 feet, taking no chances. "Mildred is a horse?" He was going to kill the X-ray tech. Wes should have warned him. Tater nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, she's a hell of a saddle bronc. Can you help her?" Patrick turned to Wes, who held a hand over his mouth like he was covering bad teeth, but it was a smile he was hiding. "I don't know. Wes, can we help her?" "I sure hope so, Doc, since you're covering for the vet tonight." Patrick's eyebrows rose, but his voice was flat. "Covering for the vet." Joe Crumpton, the vet, hadn't arranged for him to cover. "Yes, sir. Dr. John always covers for him." "And vice versa?" "Now, that wouldn't be right. A vet taking care of people? Folks wouldn't stand for it." "But it's okay for a doctor to take care of animals." Both men nod. Patrick wasn't so sure. About the closest he'd come to veterinary medicine was reading All Creatures Great and Small. "Tater, give Wes and me a minute. We'll be back to care for Mildred soon." "All righty." When they were out of earshot, Patrick said, "Okay, wiseacre, what do I do with a broken-legged bronc?" "What did you do with a broken-legged bronc rider?" "You mean that kid from KC?" "That kid from KC? Doc, you're killing me. That kid is the champion bareback bronc rider of the world, Chris Ledoux." "He didn't say anything about that when he came in. Just told me he'd be back next week for another cast because he'd be taking off the one I put on him for," Patrick made air quotes, "work." "That's Chris. But before you put the cast on him, what did you do?" Patrick looked at him blankly. "Is that a trick question?" "X-rayed it, Doc. So you're going to X-ray Mildred's leg, of course." Patrick sighed and rubbed the thinning spot in his hair, which he couldn't help doing, no matter how many times Suzanne told him to stop. I thought we'd established that Mildred wasn't coming inside. The portable X-ray machine, of course. And if it's broken, we'll cast it. Wes left off the "of course" that time, but Patrick heard it anyway. We will, huh? Yes, we will. I've never cast a horse's leg before. And he doubted medical malpractice covered it. Piece of cake for an old sawbones like you. Whenever Wes switched from calling Patrick Doc to Sawbones, it meant he was easing up. He'd given Patrick a 6-inch pocket knife for his birthday earlier that summer with Sawbones etched in the handle, plus a card that instructed him to throw away that Minnie Mouse starter knife and carry something useful. Now Patrick never went anywhere without it. At night it went on his bedstand by his wallet and watch. Putting the big knife in his pocket was just part of getting dressed in Wyoming. Patrick patted his pocket and the knife, then snorted. Piece of cake, right. He was feeling dumber and less capable by the second. He'd never been a horseman until moving to Wyoming 2 years ago, but he'd learned enough to respect a cornered animal with hard hooves, big teeth, and a strong jaw. Remembering the kick Mildred had levied at him, Patrick asked, "Do we have a twitch?" He always twitched the muzzle of his horse Reno so he wouldn't bite the horseshoer. It worked fairly well. Nope. Wes broke into a wide grin. The trick will be to move fast and stay out of the line of fire. Great. But now Patrick smiled too. Having grown up in Texas, he thought he knew the West, but Wyoming out-wested Texas and then some. A man had to be able to laugh at himself, or life got pretty unfunny real fast. Or some folks lift the opposite foot at the same time. Most horses stay pretty still with 2 feet off the ground. You can have the back end, then. I pick the front. Wes laughed. Back in the ER, the two men continued their good-natured jibes as they gathered supplies and equipment. Then Patrick heard a commotion in the reception area. Loud voices, a clattering, and a sound like flesh hitting flesh. A woman shouted, "Stop!" in an agitated voice. Patrick was out the door of the crowded supply room, knocking only 1 row of pill bottles off a shelf in the process, 1 step ahead of Wes, who was dragging a wheeled portable X-ray machine. In reception, they rushed up on a man in a game and fish uniform with the short, muscular build of a wrestler. He was holding a woman face down, 1 arm behind her, his knee against her back. Her hair covered the side of her face, but didn't muffle her voice. The woman was cussing like she meant it, expertly and with great variety. The fluorescent light crackled and blinked, strobing over the grayish-white walls and floors and silver-armed chairs. A thin man in overalls and a round woman in a lavender-flowered house dress and slippers huddled in the corner. On the opposite side of the lobby, Kim, the duty nurse, was standing between Patrick and a wiry young guy in hiking boots who was clutching his red, pimply face. Kim was a solid woman who wore her hair in a no-nonsense gray bun. She had her hands up and was speaking to the hiker in a firm voice. "Come with me, sir. I'll get you set up in the exam room." He wailed to her. "She hit me. The bitch hit me." The game and fish warden nodded at Kim. "Can we put her as far away from him as possible?" He shook out his cuffs. Patrick hadn't met him before, but he knew the previous warden, Gil Hendrickson, and assumed this man was Gil's replacement. In fact, when Gil's body was brought into the emergency room earlier in the year, shot on the job and DOA, Patrick had been the doctor on call. Kim pointed. "I'll put him in number 1. You put her in the number 4. Number 4 was farthest from the waiting room. Patrick glanced at the cowering older couple. Good call, Kim. The warden said, "Sir, do you want to press charges?" The man was bouncing back and forth on his feet, shaking his head, hands still to his jaw. "What? No, no, The warden hauled the woman to her feet, not ungently. Her face was red where it had pressed against the linoleum, but she looked otherwise uninjured. Her T-shirt was pitted out and damp around the neck. Her respiration was high, but she didn't appear to be hyperventilating. Her eyes flitted from person to person, settling on Patrick in his doctor's jacket. "I think I'm having a heart attack." Her hand went to her chest and shoulder. Unfortunately, Patrick had seen behavior and symptoms like this before, and often, in Dallas, but only once in Buffalo. She didn't look like she was having a heart attack. He was willing to bet she was high on speed. That they both were, her and the male hiker. The sweating, his hyperactivity, her chest pain, they were often side effects of amphetamine-induced anxiety. But why was Game and Fish here? "I'm Alan Turner," the warden said to him and Wes, without releasing the woman. Wes introduced himself. "I'm Dr. Flint. Nice to meet you. Where are these two from?" "They were driving erratically up on Redgrade near their campsite. I decided they needed a lift here, for obvious reasons." Game and Fish wardens were full law enforcement officers with the authority to enforce all the laws of the state of Wyoming when necessary, although the wildlife management laws were their special responsibility. Kim walked back in from getting her patient situated. "Kim, can you take the vitals while Wes and I tend to a patient outside?" If Patrick was right that speed was all that was wrong with them, it was nothing a couple of Valium wouldn't fix. Kim bobbed her head toward the female patient. "Alone?" "I'll stay with her," Alan said. Kim nodded. "In that case, no problem." "Don't leave me, doctor," the woman said. "I'm dying." She clutched her chest. "You're in good hands. I'll be back." Patrick hustled outside with Wes. "I hate seeing drug cases around here," Patrick said to him. "A lot more of it lately. Had a few last weekend when Dr. John was on call." The contrast between the quiet night and the waiting room drama was stark, save for the clattering wheels of the portable X-ray machine. Patrick stopped just shy of the parking lot. "I wonder what's going on. Hopefully it will end with tourist season." But tourist season ended with Labor Day, which had been several weeks before. Patrick's mind returned to the horse. "Did you get a look at Mildred's leg before I got here?" "I did." "How bad is it?" "It's not broken through the skin, but Miss Mildred is hurting and unhappy, pretty near her pastern joint, but I think it's clear of it. You're lucky, Doc. The prognosis for horses that break into their joint is bad. A fair number of them die of joint sepsis." "Not a compound fracture, not in the joint. No open wound, so no infection. Those were good things. Patrick didn't want another patient to die of blood poisoning on him, even a horse. Especially not after losing a patient to it for the first time the previous week. Beth Ann Jones. That had been her name. If her family hadn't waited to bring her to the hospital until she was next to death, Patrick might have had a chance to save her. People in Wyoming were nothing if not self-reliant. A little too self-reliant sometimes. "Good." Patrick resumed walking toward the trailer. Wes put a hand on his arm, stopping him again. "One of those Jones boys came by this afternoon wanting a copy of his mother's autopsy report." "Again, huh?" Patrick hadn't met them, but he kept hearing reports of their visits. "They've always been pushy. Hopefully we'll get the report soon, so they won't have any more reasons to show up here. I'm pretty anxious to get my hands on it myself." It was hard not to feel responsible when someone died on him, whether it made sense to or not. Wes released Patrick's arm, and the two men rounded the back of the trailer. Mildred was facing out now, and Tater was whispering in her ear. He nodded when he saw them. "I'm going to give Mildred a painkiller before I examine her and X-ray her leg," Patrick explained. He got into the trailer with Tater and Mildred. Mildred immediately pinned her ears and started battering the inside of the trailer with her back hooves. "Shh, Mildred." Patrick stepped closer to her. "It's okay, girl." "Maybe we ought to take her out of here, Dr. Flint," Tater said. "Good idea." Patrick wanted room to run. Tater pulled at the knot in Mildred's lead rope. "Well, hell, she's gone and snugged it up so we can't never get it untied." Patrick pulled his Sawbones pocket knife out and held it up. "Yes?" "Sure. I'll hold her, and you move in there quick and slice it off at the knot. We'll still have enough to work with." Patrick did, then dropped the knife back into his pocket. Wes said, "That Minnie Mouse knife wouldn't have done that now, would it?" Patrick grinned. Tater walked Mildred out of the trailer without further injury, thanks to the first-rate splint someone had put on her leg. Then he tied her lead to a side slat. Patrick approached her again, aiming to give her a shot in her neck. The horse struck, quick as a rattler, and sunk her teeth into Patrick's chest. "Ah!" he yelled. His shoulder dipped and his knees bent. "Son of a buzzard bait!" Tater whacked Mildred on her side, but Mildred held on for 2 excruciating seconds before releasing Patrick. He backed away quickly. She swished her tail. Wes crossed his arms. Son of a what? Patrick didn't answer. He rubbed his chest. She hadn't broken the skin. He'd have a good raspberry tomorrow, though. Tater stroked his mare's nose. Sorry, Dr. Flint. Mildred's a mite short-tempered. Something he wished Tater had told him before he got in range of her teeth. And here I thought everybody loved you, Doc, Wes said. Patrick shot Wes a look. To Tater he said, You ever given a horse a shot? A time or two. Patrick handed him the syringe. Knock yourself out, then. Wes coughed into his hand, but it sounded a lot more like laughing. Pounding feet and a breathless voice startled Patrick. Dr. Flint, we got a call. It was Kim. Kim never ran. What is it? He backed away from Mildred to keep both himself and Kim out of range. A deputy attacked by a prisoner. They're transporting him here. Patrick could move to the ends of the earth and not get away from the worst of what man was capable of. His heart plummeted. He knew the local deputies. One lived next door to him and his family. Johnson County? Bighorn. He didn't know any of the Bighorn County deputies. That didn't minimize the tragedy, though. How far out are they? 45 minutes. And the patients inside? Their vitals are consistent with amphetamines, no other indicators. And the older couple, she's diabetic and forgot to refill her insulin. Patrick closed his eyes for a long second. All right, then. 5 milligrams of Valium and observation for our speedy customers. Check the glucose level of our diabetic patient. We'll get Mildred squared away, and then I'll be in to check on everybody and sign prescriptions. We should be done before the ambulance arrives. Thanks, Kim, and let me know if anything changes. Got it. She nodded and retreated to the hospital. A heavy-set man appeared in her place with a Great Pyrenees in his arms. The dog's head hung on his shoulder, facing away from Patrick. One paw rested on the man's arms. Patrick did a double-take. Make that one paw caught in a bear trap. The man said, Are you the doc covering for the vet? Patrick wanted to deny it, but he said, I am, and thought, It's going to be a long, long night. Chapter 2. Stop. Buffalo, Wyoming, September 18th, 1976, 10 a.m. Suzanne. Suzanne knew she should feel guilty, but she didn't. Trish was still sawing logs, and Perry had parked himself in front of the TV, where he was watching college football. She glanced at her son. Belly down on the brown shag carpeting, he wore only his Superman underwear. His chin was in his hands, his knees bent, his feet swinging in the air. A mini Burt Reynolds on his bearskin rug, she thought, and giggled. Neither kid was ready to leave. Neither of them had packed. Her either, for that matter. She sipped from a hot mug of what Patrick called her coffee-colored water. It was 10 o'clock, and she was at the kitchen table in a bright red caftan house dress she'd made herself. A swap meet local radio show touted puppies, fencing supplies, and workhorse harnesses. It competed with the TV in the other room and the snores of Ferdinand, their Irish wolfhound foundling, who ate them out of house and home and perpetually smelled like he'd rolled in dead prairie dog. Through the picture window, across the back of the combined living and dining room, she could see the golden fall leaves on the aspens in the backyard shimmering in the breeze and sun. Despite the urging of the ticking clock, she didn't move. She was missing her mother and sister in a paralyzing way. She'd already used up her monthly long-distance budget talking to them in the first 2 weeks of September. Letters would have to do, but they only wrote her back 1 to every 3 she sent to them. She understood. They had each other and their familiar family, friends, and communities. She was the lonely one. Why had Patrick had to move them so far away from everyone they cared about? Except for each other, of course. It seemed like he was trying to recapture an element, location, of the dream he'd abandoned in favor of medical school, to be a happily impoverished wildlife biologist or forest ranger. Sure, she'd made a few friends in Buffalo, but it wasn't the same as back home. Well, except for Evangeline Sibley. The pregnant rancher's wife was the next best thing to having her own sister here. Patrick was great friends with Vanjie's husband Henry, too. But truth be told, the rest of the native Wyoming women were just too rugged and outdoorsy for Suzanne. Most of them had never met a tube of lipstick or compact of rouge. They hunted and fished with, or without, the men. Suzanne was proud of being a Southern lady. She didn't want to be like the local women, but she still felt somehow insubstantial around them. As if to confirm her thoughts, the radio announcer said, "Becky Wills has drawn a moose tag over near Jackson and is looking for someone to keep her boys, aged 3, 5, and 7, for about 10 days while she and her husband are out of town for the hunt." Only in Wyoming would a woman advertise on the radio to find someone to babysit her kids so she could go hunting. Suzanne would have never left her kids with strangers, not in Texas anyway. She might be in the same boat if she had to leave town in a hurry for an emergency, but it sure wouldn't be to hunt. How was she supposed to gel with women like Becky Wills? And they were all like her. Trish walked into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. Some of her blonde hair made a fuzzy frame around her face and head, having worked its way loose from 2 long French braids. "What's for breakfast?" Ferdinand stood. He stretched his skinny, scraggly pony body into a downward dog. Then, like a greyhound, he bounced and floated over to Trish. She hugged him around the neck and cooed to him. "Perry, Ferdy, and I ate 2 hours ago. There's life cereal in the pantry." Trish's eyes narrowed and her nose wrinkled, but she grabbed a bowl and spoon, setting them down a little too hard on the thick slab tabletop. Suzanne winced. The table was special to her, along with the matching hutch beside it. Rich, polished walnut, brass fittings, glass doors, the first pieces of new furniture she and Patrick had ever purchased. Luckily, the placemat absorbed the impact of the bowl. Trish went back for the cereal and milk. "Your dad is at the hospital. He's going to want to leave as soon as he gets back." "Like, goody for him." "Trish," the tone of her voice said, "enough of that." She sighed. "You're not too old to spank." She wasn't proud of it, but Suzanne had broken yardsticks, wooden spoons, hairbrushes, and sticks on her kids' behinds. It hadn't slowed them down much. "If you can catch me." Suzanne pointed at her daughter's hair. "That's what tails are for." Trish poured cereal and milk into her bowl. She clanked the spoon against her teeth, then slurped the milk out of a big bite. "What time will he get here?" "Manners, Trish. I expected him already." "Thanks for waking me up." Suzanne pretended not to notice the sarcasm. "You're welcome." The phone rang. Hoping it was her mom or sister, Suzanne dove for it. She wasn't as fast as her daughter. "Flint residence, Trish speaking." The teenager rolled her eyes as she said the greeting her parents required of her. She listened for a moment. "He's not here right now. Let me get my mother." Holding the phone out to Suzanne, she said, "They want to leave a message, you know." "Don't say you know. I don't know unless you tell me." Suzanne growled, but snatched the phone from her daughter. "This is Suzanne Flint." "Hello, Mrs. Flint. This is Hal Grable, the county coroner." "Hello, Mr. Grable. We met at the pancake breakfast for the fire department, I believe." "Indeed we did. I just tried Patrick at the hospital and didn't reach him there. Can you have him call me?" "Sorry. He must be on his way home. Will he know what this is about?" "I have some final questions for him before I release the Jones autopsy and report." He recited a phone number. Suzanne knew which case that was. Her husband had been out of sorts ever since he hadn't been able to save the elderly woman's life. Patrick was brilliant, and she knew he'd done his best. Sometimes bad things just happen. No reason why. Humans live, humans die, and doctors aren't God. But too few people understand that. "No problem." "Thanks." Suzanne placed the phone back in the cradle. Her mind drifted to the night Beth Ann Jones died. Patrick had cried in Suzanne's arms. Her eyes burned. She had gotten so lucky in the husband department in many ways. Maybe Wyoming wouldn't be forever. Trish's spoon clattered to the table, off the placemat. With her mouth full, she said, "Why is Dad making us go elk hunting with him anyway?" Good question. One she ignored from her daughter. Arguments with teenage girls were to be avoided at all costs. "Get your wet spoon off my table." Trish did it, slowly. A thought struck Suzanne. She understood why Patrick wanted to go. He loved to hunt. She even got how much he wanted to spend time with the kids and share this activity he loved with them. But why did she have to go? She was with the kids all the time. In her mind, she ticked off points against hunting. She hated, in no particular order, being cold, sleeping on the hard ground, shooting, horses, and dead things. In a flash, she knew why she hadn't made the kids' pack or finished getting her own things ready. She wasn't going. "Mom, did you hear me?" I asked. "Why is Dad making us go?" The front door opened and shut. Patrick was home. Ferdinand trotted downstairs to greet him. She heard Patrick say hello, then send the dog outside. "Ask your father." Perry was so engrossed with the TV that he didn't hear his father come in. If he had, he would have jumped up and turned off the set. Patrick and Suzanne usually limited the kids to The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau or Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, and one cartoon a week. In her funk, Suzanne had let Perry's unauthorized add to the watching schedule slide. Patrick's light brown head appeared at the top of the stairs, which opened onto the living room, and Perry. "Who's ready for the hunt?" His handsome face looked drawn, and his light blue eyes hollowed, but his voice was cheerful. "Hey, honey," Suzanne said. "Long night?" Trish went back to her cereal. Every milk slurp and teeth clank raised Suzanne's ire. She felt on the brink of an ugly mood swing, so she pasted on a smile. "Unbelievably hard. I'll tell you all about it on the way into the mountains." Patrick frowned as he approached Suzanne. He ducked to avoid a light fixture hanging from the low ceiling. He was only 6 feet tall, but the fixture was oddly placed. Why is Perry watching football? Hearing his name, Perry finally registered his father's presence and jumped to his feet. He backed to the TV and turned it off. "I just let him turn it on for a second while he ate." Suzanne crossed her fingers in her lap and hoped the kids wouldn't rat her out. Patrick kissed Suzanne's cheek, then put his wallet and keys on the kitchen counter. "Are the bags ready to load in the truck?" Perry wandered over to the table. He ducked his head. "Not yet." "I thought you were excited to finally be old enough to hunt, bud." "I was. I am. I'll be ready fast. But, Dad, how come I can't play football? I'm old enough for that, too." "Because I don't want you to have a cracked skull. We've already talked about this. You can play when you're in the 8th grade. He looked away from his son and at Trish and Suzanne in turn. "Now, get ready. All of you. Daylight's a-wasting, and we're going hunting." He almost sang his last few words and did a few bad steps of the hustle. "Do I have to?" Trish asked, her voice wheedling. The dancing stopped. "I'll pretend you didn't just ask that. Get moving." The kids filed out, Perry on his tiptoes and excited, Trish with hunched shoulders and a scowl on her face. "What's with her?" Patrick asked. He poured himself a bowl of cereal and a cup of coffee. "She's a 15-year-old girl. She wants to be with her friends. And I think from the way she's jumping every time the phone rings that there may be a boy in the picture." "She's too young for boys." "Same age I was when I started seeing you." "Exactly my point." Suzanne smiled at him. "Maybe she's like me in more ways than one." "What do you mean?" There's no way what she was about to tell him would go well, but she had to get it over with. "I hate hunting." "You don't hate hunting." She braced herself. "I do. I don't like guns at all, or horses. Cindy stumbles all the time. It scares me, and I've decided I'm not going on the trip." Patrick's bowl crashed to the floor, splattering milk and cereal on the linoleum, the cabinets, and all the way over to the carpet. "You've what?" The eyes he turned on her were stormy. "Yeah, it wasn't going well at all." Chapter 3. Sidewind. Buffalo, Wyoming, September 18th, 1976, 11 a.m. Trish. Trish picked up the yellow donut phone her parents had given her for her 14th birthday. She dialed, messed up, and dialed again. As the line was ringing, she sat in her hanging basket chair and swiveled back and forth, admiring the flare of her bell-bottom jeans. Her mom wouldn't let her wear the platform sandals with them that she craved, but they didn't look bad with her imitation dingo boots. She heard raised voices upstairs. Planting her feet in the carpet, she held her breath so she could hear. "I said I'm not going." Her mother's voice was firm. She didn't stand up to Trish's father too often, but when she did it in a big way. "You're going to ruin the trip for everyone?" her dad asked. A woman's voice in her ear interrupted her eavesdropping. "Hello?" "May I speak to Brendan, please?" Trish asked, using the polite voice she reserved for grown-ups other than her own parents, and speaking softly so her parents wouldn't hear her. Who was she kidding? Her dad had just yelled something back at her mother. When the two of them got all emotional, they were in a world of their own. "Who's calling?" The woman sounded skeptical. "Trish Flint." "Flint?" Mrs. Lewis made a hard T sound at the end of the word. It reminded Trish of when a baby grasshopper had flown into her mouth and she'd spit it out. "Yes." Trish could hear the woman breathing while she considered Trish's request. Mrs. Lewis was a nurse, and Trish had overheard her parents talking about her getting fired last month. Something about stealing stuff, and that her dad had been the one to catch her. Mrs. Lewis probably didn't like Trish's dad too much. Would that mean she wouldn't approve of Trish either? Trish didn't have time to try to win her over. If Mrs. Lewis didn't get Brendan soon, Trish wouldn't have a chance to talk to him before her dad force-marched her out the door for the stupid camping trip. "Hold, please." A sharp clank told Trish that Mrs. Lewis had dropped the phone on the counter. Not nice, lady. Trish started to count. If she reached 100 and Mrs. Lewis hadn't brought Brendan to the phone, she'd hang up. Her dad would not be happy if he came downstairs and found her on the phone instead of packing. Trish's mother shouted loud enough for the neighbors to hear, something she wouldn't normally do. "I hate hunting and guns and camping and being told what to do, and you knew all of this before you planned the trip." Right on, Mom. If she won't go, Dad won't make me. Then she remembered all the church activities going on that weekend. If she stayed here, her mom would make her go. She forced Perry and Trish into every single function their church offered. Sunday school, vacation Bible school. The only thing she liked about VBS was memorizing verses to win prizes, because she always won. Church camp, car washes, bake sales, and now youth group. Brendan's family belonged to the same church, but hardly ever showed up. Which was better, missing church or not having to hunt? Her dad was getting more and more wound up. "I've been looking forward to this trip. I never get to spend time with the kids." Nothing sounded scarier than her dad's voice when he was mad. Trish shivered, but Suzanne wasn't scared of Patrick. "I do. I could use a break." "Nice, Mom. Love you too." Then she heard Brendan. Like, "Hello." His voice was smiling. Heat rushed into Trish's face. She couldn't believe she'd gotten up the nerve to call him. She'd never called a guy before. She forgot all about her arguing parents. Like, "Hi yourself." "What's crackin'?" Around Brendan, Trish felt so square. She loved the way he talked, like he was from California or something, even though he was born and raised in Buffalo. "My dad is taking us bow hunting, for elk, you know." Far out. Trish considered agreeing with him. Brendan was a serious hunk, and a senior, 2 years ahead of her in school. All the girls liked him. She was pretty sure he liked her, but he'd only called her a few times, and he hadn't asked her to go with him or anything. Her friends agreed that it was important to let guys talk about themselves and act as if you liked the same things they did, but Trish wasn't very good at pretending, even if it might mess things up. "Not far out. He's making us miss school and everything." "Miss Perfect Grades might get a B." She heard a click on the phone line. Did someone just pick up? "I don't think so," Brendan said. "Hello, hello, is anyone there?" There was no answer. Trish rotated her chair toward the window and spoke lower. "My mom doesn't want to go either, but she's letting my dad take me. She's like aiding and abetting kidnapping. I should just run away." "Right on. Don't let the man push you around." Trish heard laughter in his voice. "Are you trying to fake me out?" "Yeah, a little. Relax. Hunting is far out. You're lucky." "Like, if you say so." She felt goofy trying to talk like him, and she wasn't even sure she was doing it right. "Where's he taking you?" "I don't know. Somewhere near Hunter Corral is what he told my mom." "You're packing in?" "Backpacking?" "No, on horses, goof." "Oh, yeah, on horses. And then we're camping." "Groovy." "Maybe you should go instead of me." "Or I could just drive up there and say, hey." "That would be cool." Heat gushed into her cheeks again. Her father's voice boomed from the bottom of the stairs. "Trish, why isn't your bag by the door? I need you outside right now." "I've got to go, Brendan." She paused, almost holding her breath, hoping he would make things official between them. That would be worth a few extra seconds and her dad's wrath. All he said was, "Keep on truckin'." Some of the high she'd felt from talking to him leaked out of her. If she came back to find he was going with Charla Newby, she'd never forgive her dad. Charla. Gag. Long curly black hair and big dark eyes. First place barrel racer at the junior rodeo this year. Charla got everything she wanted, and lately Trish had heard she wanted Brendan. Yeah, check you later." She hung up and faced the glowering parent who was now in her door. He didn't look so tough with the blue-flowered wallpaper framing him in the doorway, though. "Were you on the phone?" "Sorry, I had to talk to a friend about getting my assignments for me, since I'm missing class." "Get moving now." She screwed up her courage and blurted, "Dad, if Mom's not going, I'm not either." "Oh, yes, you are, young lady." "But I don't like to hunt." It was true. She didn't mind shooting targets. Her dad thought shooting was a necessary life skill, and he'd taught her to shoot when she was 11. Perry had been even younger. "Everything starts with safety, and safety starts with knowledge," he'd said. He made her load and operate a rifle, a revolver, and a shotgun, all on her own. Her mom had insisted that if he was going to teach them to shoot, he would teach them to defend themselves in other ways as well. He'd run self-defense like a class, with a mat on the living room floor, and his 3 students, if you counted her mom, facing him. He'd lecture them. "Whatever a bad guy is going to do with you somewhere else is always worse than what he's going to do to you right here. So fight, fight, fight." Then he'd drill them on self-defense moves, eye-stabbing, headbutts to the nose, groin kicks. Honestly, her dad was kind of intense and super geeky. In the end, she didn't like fighting, but shooting was fun, and she was good at it. She liked the revolver best. It didn't kick her shoulder. Lately, his new compound bow had been her dad's obsession, and she and Perry had been practicing with him. But then he'd made her go antelope hunting with him last year. She hadn't wanted to shoot it alone, so he'd reached around her and held the rifle with her. He'd even put his finger over hers on the trigger. Their first tandem shot had hit the animal, but probably thanks to her, hadn't killed it. Her dad had quickly taken a solo shot to put it out of its misery. The thought that she'd hurt an animal and that it had suffered, even for a second, because of her, it was horrible. She'd cried and cried. After she calmed down, they'd had to field dress it. Her dad had made her watch the whole thing. Gross. Gross and sad. And it took forever. Then they had to haul it into the truck and home. Yuck. And all they ate was antelope for weeks. She liked antelope, but she got really sick of it, and she remembered the awful hunt every single meal. Her dad was still talking. "You don't have to like to hunt. You're still going." "I don't want to." "I didn't ask if you wanted to." His voice changed from dark to light. "But it's going to be fun. You'll see." She changed her tone from defiant to sad. "My friends are all going to be at a birthday party." "Too bad they don't have cool dads to take them on elk hunts." Since sad didn't work, she rolled her eyes. "I'm missing a week of school." "Not a whole week. I told your mother we'd only stay out 4 days. Trish's heart leapt. "Only 4 days?" She did a fist pump. "Yes." "Don't act so excited." He turned halfway from the door, looking at her over his shoulder. "I'm going to hook up the trailer. Meet me down at the gate to help me load the horses. And bring your bag and your brother." She jumped to her feet and stood at attention. "Yes, sir, Sergeant, sir." "Very funny." "And change your clothes into something you can wear in the mountains," he'd said, and left. Seconds later, the front door slammed shut behind him. Grumbling, Trish pulled clothes haphazardly from her drawers and stuffed them in a bag. Then she hopped on one leg and tore off her boots. She tossed her cute outfit onto the almost dingoes, making a crumpled pile in the middle of the floor. When she was dressed in a t-shirt, jeans, and cowboy boots, she made one last change, removing the black rubber bands from her braids and replacing them with the smiley face ball fasteners she still loved but couldn't wear in public anymore. Then she hefted her bag over her shoulder. Maybe she wouldn't need all this stuff, but she didn't care. Sometimes it got colder than a deuce in September in the mountains. Being cold sucked. She hustled out of her room, sighing, and nearly ran into her mother in the hallway. It was dark, since the whole back of the downstairs was underground and didn't have windows, although the front did. It was kind of like a giant dugout, which she only knew because her dad had made her play baseball 2 summers ago. On the boys' team, because there was no girls' team. It had been mortifying. Trish expected to see a laundry basket in her mother's arms. The only room on the hallway besides her own was the laundry room, and since her mom claimed to be happier not seeing the mess in Trish's room, she never went in it if she could help it. But she wasn't carrying laundry. In the other direction was the central staircase, and beyond it, a big open room their parents called the playroom. Trish listened to records in it. Perry did whatever it was Perry did while she was ignoring him. But her mom wasn't heading to the playroom either. She was coming for Trish. "I didn't hear the phone ring," Suzanne said, blocking Trish's path. Her long brown hair was pulled into a low ponytail at the nape of her neck. She was pretty and curvy and vivacious, so much so that half the boys at Trish's school had a crush on her. Trish hoped Brendan didn't. How embarrassing would that be? Like it didn't. "But I heard you talking to Brendan Lewis." "Were you on the phone?" Trish's voice rose. She remembered the click. Suzanne didn't answer her question. Nice girls don't call boys, especially older boys. "Maybe, back in the Stone Age, but it's 1976 in Wyoming, and girls can call boys." "He'll never call you if you do it for him." Was her mom seriously saying she wasn't a nice girl and that Brendan would never call her? "Thanks for the tip, Mom. I've got to go. Dad is making me help him load. Where's the brat?" "Don't talk about your brother like that." Trish stepped around her mom. When she got to the bottom of the stairs, she hollered, "Perry, we've got to go. Come on." Perry appeared, dragging an army green canvas duffel down one step at a time behind him and carrying his tackle box and fishing pole in the other. "I'm coming." "Like, if you move any slower, I'll be as old as Mom by the time you get here." Her mother sighed from right behind her. "Trish, it's true. Listen, tell your dad the coroner wants him to call." "Why don't you tell him yourself?" "Ooh, smart mouth, you're going to get it," Perry crowed. He bounced on his toes, and his face was gleeful. "I'm too mad at your father to speak to him." Trish tossed the tail of her braid over her shoulder. "You can't be too mad. I didn't hear you break anything." "I don't break things." "You did that time you threw a coffee cup at Dad," Perry said. "And another time when you threw a plate at him," Trish added. "I have no idea what you're talking about." She sniffed and kissed each of them on the cheek. Trish and Perry looked at each other with raised eyebrows. Their mom always acted like she couldn't remember whatever she didn't want to talk about. Her mom climbed the stairs to the landing. "Mind your father and be careful. I'll see you in 4 days." Trish groaned. "If we survive that long." Perry bunched his fists and twisted them in the corners of his eyes like he was crying. "Wah, Trish has to go hunting. Wah, wah." She threw open the door, letting in bright fall sunlight. Ferdinand stood just outside, wagging his long, curved tail. "Come on, Dork. Let's get this over with." Chapter 4. Charge. Interstate 90, north of Buffalo, Wyoming, September 18, 1976, noon. Patrick. At the intersection of Main and Airport Road, Patrick stopped the truck, even though there was no traffic in either direction. The Ford engine was purring like a kitten after its tune-up earlier that week. He breathed in the air through the open windows. Freedom. 4 whole days with his kids. not being on call with no phones, no kicking horses, drugged-up hikers, snapping dogs, or worst of all, murdered law enforcement officers. Because the deputy that had been rushed into the ER early that morning had been dead. Violently, senselessly dead. People could be so depraved. As a doctor, he hated that sometimes good wasn't enough to best evil. As a parent, he just worried about how to protect his kids from it. This had happened here, not in a big city, not in a foreign country, but right here in northern Wyoming, too close to his home. And because of his job, he was thrown into the thick of it. He enjoyed practicing medicine, but he wasn't going to miss the hospital while he was gone. He needed a break. The only thing he'd miss while he was on this trip would be his wife. He felt a pang at the thought, deep in his chest, melancholy mixed with annoyance. Maybe he'd been too hard on Suzanne, but he shouldn't have had to be. She should have wanted to be with him. Still, the last thing he wanted was to be harsh with everyone around him, like his own dad had been. He and Suzanne had a great relationship, and it shouldn't matter that she didn't like some of the things he did. She was fun and adventurous and his partner. But if he didn't get her out enjoying what made Wyoming wonderful, she'd never fall in love with it. Then it would only be a matter of time before he'd be driving a U-Haul back to Texas. Trish looked up from her book. He knew she was reading Judy Blume's Forever, again, even though she was hiding the cover. He and Suzanne had decided to just let it go, even though the novel dealt with teen sexuality. Every teen tackled these issues. Hell, that's why he and Suzanne had married so young, because the teenage sex drive would not be denied. He smiled. Like, why are we stopped? And you're talking to yourself. Again. Patrick hadn't even realized his lips were moving. He gave her his best impression of a cool cat and mimicked her speech pattern. Like, because I'm deciding which way to go, you know. But suddenly, he'd made up his mind. He turned left. Trish groaned. You can be such a geek. But she didn't say like or you know. He'd shut her slang down. Mission accomplished. She frowned. Dad, Hunter Corrals is to the right. I was only taking us there because your mother likes campsites with bathrooms. So do I. It will be too crowded on the weekend. We're going to Walker Prairie instead. Patrick was excited. There were more elk up there, fewer people, and new places to explore. From the back seat, Perry snored. Patrick glanced at his son in the rearview mirror. He was pretty darn cute with his blonde crew cut, freckled face, and drool pooling on his chin. 5 minutes into the trip, and his boy was sleeping. He smiled. That was par for the course. Trish slammed her book shut and turned to face him, her voice suddenly loud and shrill. But you said Hunter Corral. Perry sat up. Huh? What? Patrick put on his blinker. Left, toward the northern bighorns. What's the big deal? Trish reopened her book, muttering something about him messing up her plans with her friends. He knew from past experience that discretion was the better part of valor and didn't ask her to repeat herself. Instead, he turned on the radio. Joy to the World by Three Dog Night was playing. He turned the volume up as loud as it would go without static. Pounding the steering wheel, he sang along. Perry joined in. Would you guys stop? Someone could see you, Trish said. There was nothing and no one but them on Interstate 90, 5 miles north of Buffalo and 30 miles south of Sheridan. Perry leaned toward her ear and sang louder. She swatted at him, and he ducked. It wasn't long ago that she would have sung along, bouncing in the seat. Where has my little girl gone, and when did this sulky creature replace her? Her attitude took some of the wind out of his sails, but he didn't let her see it. No way was he going to let her ruin this trip for Perry, or for him. They passed Lake DeSmet. Look, guys, he pointed to a herd of antelope. Big because it was rutting season, 50 or more of them, enjoying the last offerings of the season from some poor farmer's fields. It was an everyday scene this time of year. What he wanted most to see, and hadn't yet, was a herd of bighorn sheep in the wild up in the Bighorns. He'd seen them at Yellowstone, of course. Anyone could see them at Yellowstone. They were practically domesticated there. What he craved to see was the rapidly vanishing creatures wild in their home mountains, where they were once so numerous that Indians had named the Bighorn River for them, and later Lewis and Clark had adopted the name for the entire mountain range. That male must be quite a stud to have such a big group of ladies. Did you know that the pronghorns communicate danger to each other by raising their white rump hairs? Really? Perry said. That's kind of gross, Trish said. They have exceptionally good vision, and they're the second fastest land animals in the world, the kids recited together. We know, Dad, Trish said. Patrick smiled and stared into the herd and beyond. The early fall grassland colors looked monotone to some people, but he saw a whole palette of tans, browns, grays, and blacks. The life cycle of the prairie never ceased to amaze him. As he contemplated nature, the truck wandered to the shoulder. Dad, Trish's voice made the word into 3 syllables. Watch where you're going. Like, I don't want to die today? Whoops, he corrected course. Bad Leroy Brown came on. Jim Croce was Patrick's favorite. He and Perry shouted the words over the music. Trish's foot started tapping. By the last chorus, her lips were moving too. Bald eagle, Perry shouted in his ear. His son pointed to a power line. One of the majestic birds was perched there, head swiveling as it scanned for prey. Good eyes, kid. He snuck a glance at Trish. Who wants to stop in Sheridan for McDonald's? He asked. Trish knocked her book to the floorboard with enthusiasm. Last real food for days? Are you kidding me? Fat Fred's yes. Patrick steered off the interstate and parked the truck and trailer on a side street, feeling only a little bit like a sellout for buying his kids' affection with fast food. When Trish and Perry were little, he and Suzanne couldn't say French fries in the car without a riot. They'd started discussing potential McDonald's stops in code, calling French fries Fat Fred's. They thought they were clever, but 4-year-old Trish had been onto them from the first utterance and ratted them out to her little brother. French fries became Fat Fred's henceforth and forevermore in their family lore. As they parked and got out, a loud crash sounded from the trailer. Trish said, There she goes again. It was Cindy, Suzanne's horse. She had a terrible habit of kicking the inside of the trailer. She could do it for hours. The sides of their trailer bore hoof-shaped dents as witness. He hoped she didn't get her little undersized feet stuck in there someday, although it might cure her of the kicking. They filed inside the restaurant. His friend Henry Sibley was depositing wrappers from a tray into the trash. Patrick walked up behind the lanky rancher and clapped him on the shoulder. Dust puffed up from his shirt. Hey, Sib. Henry whirled, then grinned. Doc, kids, what are you guys up to? Elk hunting, Perry said, his voice excited. Oh, man, you lucky dogs. I wish I could go hunting this weekend. What do you have going on? Patrick asked. Hay delivery. Too bad. We'll invite you and Vanjie over for elk steak sometime soon then. I'm using my new compound bow. What'd you get? A Darton. Nice. Which one? The Trailmaster 45K. Let me know how it performs in the field. Henry frowned. Hey, can I talk to you for a second? Patrick pulled a 20 out of his wallet and handed it to Trish. Get me a Big Mac, small fries, and a Coke. Yes, sir. She and Perry raced each other to the line, throwing a few elbows as they jockeyed for position. So much for his daughter worrying about what people would think of their behavior. As soon as the kids were out of earshot, Patrick said, What's up? I was just talking to Harry Bethel. Patrick had to think for a second until he remembered who Bethel was. He's a Sheridan County deputy, isn't he? Yep. He told me a prisoner killed a deputy and escaped custody last night during transport from county to state facilities. Billy Kamecki, the one that killed that Gil Hendrickson with game and fish. Yep, I was on call. They brought the deputy into the ER. A young guy named Robert Hayes. He was gone by the time he arrived. Nothing we could do. Left behind a wife and a baby. Very sad. How did Kamecki get him? Strangled him with a wire, then snapped his neck for good measure. That's bad. Really bad. Henry wiped his hand down his forehead to his chin, leaving a weary expression behind. Did you hear anything else when they brought him in? They said it happened on the west side of the mountains near Ten Sleep. when they were driving him down to the state penitentiary, but that's about all I know. You don't want to run into Kameki. Not a nice fella. Patrick nodded. Where were you planning to hunt? Walker Prairie. Patrick hadn't really thought about it, but Walker Prairie was all the way across Cloud Peak Wilderness from Ten Sleep. That was a plus. Henry said, Good. Then he gave Patrick directions to his favorite spot to camp, close to what he considered the best hunting areas. He'd grown up hunting the area, so he knew what he was talking about. Perry trotted up, dangling a paper McDonald's bag and grinning. Dad, we got your food. Patrick rubbed the boy's stubbly hair. The kid hadn't had a growth spurt yet. He was pretty much a runt, with a high-pitched voice and a soft middle. Had Patrick been like that as a kid? He seemed to recall growing late. He'd turned out normal-sized, and Perry would too, he hoped. But damn if the boy wasn't all heart. His smile washed away a little of his lingering disquiet from the hard night before and from his row with Suzanne. He couldn't help smiling back at him. On my way, son. Then he noticed Trish wasn't with him. Where's your sister? Pay phone. Perry gave him a conspiratorial eye roll and sigh. Huh. Who in the world did she already have to talk to? She'd only hung up from her last phone call an hour before. Oh well, he'd just have to accept that when it came to teenage girls, he might never completely understand. Henry nodded at him. Watch your six. Patrick saluted with 2 fingers to his forehead. Always. Chapter 5. Pause. Buffalo, Wyoming, September 18th, 1976, 12:30 p.m. Suzanne. Through the storefront windows, Suzanne could see locals and a few late-season tourists crowding the Busy Bee Cafe. The place was a local institution. Sandwiched between Clear Creek and the Occidental Hotel, it shared some of the latter's Old West charm. Wooden siding, an old wood-burning stove in the dining area, an ornate countertop and bar back. The tourists were easily identifiable by their bulky cameras and relaxed demeanors. Labor Day was the end of the summer season, but the area did get some early autumn visitors to admire the fall leaves and enjoy the crisp weather in relative solitude. Hunters, too, were starting to show up, easily identifiable in too much camo and in need of a bathtub, but she didn't see any in the restaurant. As she reached for the door, Suzanne heard her name called from behind her. She turned to see Hal Graybull, the county coroner. He was crossing the street and waving, his figure a cutout against the red brick facades of the downtown buildings. Darn. She hadn't told Patrick that the coroner had called. Leaving it to Trish had been petulant of her, and she regretted it. This was Patrick's job, their livelihood. She pasted on a smile and waved back. Mrs. Flint, nice to see you, so soon after speaking to you. Graybull's ruddy cheeks and white beard reminded her of Santa Claus, but one in need of a few good meals. His belt was fighting a losing battle against gravity, with no hips or butt to hold his pants up. After they shook, she shielded her eyes from the midday sun with one hand. You too. Were you able to get my message to Dr. Flint? We're under a fair bit of pressure from the family to close out the Jones case. Did he not call you? It wasn't a lie, but still, she almost touched her nose to see if it was growing. I'm so sorry. It was a hectic morning. He left to go elk hunting with the kids for a few days, but he'll be back Wednesday. Hal tugged at his beard, his face somber, but then he smiled. 'Tis the season. Yes, it is. They're camping at a hunter corral, if it's an emergency. I'll just take my phone off the hook, and then it won't be. She laughed. Is everything okay on the case? I'm not at liberty to say much, other than Dr. Flint did all he could. I wouldn't be surprised if the family files suit anyway. He lowered his voice and looked over both shoulders before stepping closer to her. You didn't hear this from me, but it wouldn't be the first time they've sued someone when things didn't go their way. Oh, no. So we're needing to make sure we dot all the I's and cross all the T's. But again, don't worry. Your husband wasn't at fault. I'll be sure he calls you first thing when he gets in. Hopefully they'll have caught that fugitive long before then. What fugitive? You haven't heard? It's all over the radio. A prisoner killed a Bighorn deputy and escaped in his vehicle over near Ten Sleep. The same guy that murdered the game warden. Oh my goodness! Ten Sleep was on the other side of the mountains, but she was spending the night alone, and she lived in the country. She'd have to keep Patrick's shotgun by the bed. They've got every state, federal, and local law enforcement officer in the northern half of the state looking for him. He's a local guy, too. Grew up in Buffalo. The radio promised updates on the hour. I'll be sure to tune in. Take care, Mrs. Flint. You too, Mr. Graybull. He tipped an imaginary hat to her, then walked back across the street, pants sagging dangerously, whistling Blueberry Hill. Suzanne hustled into the restaurant and stood at the door looking for Vanjie. A group seated under the huge bison head looked familiar, but she couldn't remember their names. She kept scanning. In addition to the packed tables, every round-seated stool at the bar was full. Some of the wait staff were clustered near the coffee station, staying out of the way as patrons stood in line for the sole bathroom. Cutlery clanked pottery, cutting through the din of conversations. The place was a zoo. Suzanne heard, "Over here." Vanjie waved from a table overlooking Clear Creek. Her friend was dressed in jeans and a yellow T-shirt, her black hair in a no-nonsense bob, like the native Wyomingites, but her thick Tennessee accent gave away her southern roots. Suzanne knew her own Texas accent betrayed her as well. Maybe that's why she'd been so drawn to Vanjie in the first place. Two fish out of their native waters. But Vanjie was swimming, whereas Suzanne felt like she was sinking. Vanjie sat with her back to the creek, which Suzanne still pronounced with a long E sound instead of as crick, like the locals. Another way in which she didn't blend. She smoothed the neckline bow of her polka-dotted blouse. And another. "I ordered you a sweet tea." Vanjie had set the glass on Suzanne's placemat, a laminated menu. "I do that just to mess with them. It always comes out unsweet with sugar packets in a spoon." Suzanne shuddered. Not the same thing. Actually, she drank her tea unsweet, so she was glad for it, but she understood Vanjie's point. "I mean, I boil my hummingbird feed, for heaven's sake. Sugar doesn't dissolve in cold water. Any real cook knows that." Vanjie arched a brow toward the kitchen, as if to suggest that possibly there was no real cook back there. The two women ordered chef salads and caught up on each other's lives. "How's the baby?" Suzanne asked. Vanjie's pregnancy was a secret except to close friends. She'd had several miscarriages, and she wasn't yet through her first trimester with this baby. Vanjie looked out at the creek. It was low, mostly rock instead of water. "I'm spotting." "Oh, no. Maybe it's nothing. What does your doctor say?" Vanjie had started seeing an obstetrician in Billings, Montana. "I haven't told him yet. I'm afraid to talk to him." "You've got to call." "I know. I will if it gets worse." Suzanne reached for Vanjie's hand and squeezed it. "Can I do anything?" "Your prayers and friendship are all I need." She wiped a tear, then her face changed. She smiled, which accentuated her high, round cheekbones. "I was surprised when you asked me to lunch. I thought you were going elk hunting." "I was." "And?" Vanjie may be her closest Wyoming friend, but Suzanne doesn't talk out of school about Patrick. Not to anyone. Patrick needed some bonding time with the kids. "What a good dad." The waitress placed their salads in front of them. "Anything else?" Her mouth had the dry, wrinkled appearance of a lifelong smoker. Vanjie winked at Suzanne. "More sweet tea, please." The waitress sighed and headed back to the kitchen. Suzanne dug into her salad. Forget sweet tea. What she missed was good ranch dressing, homemade with real buttermilk. All she could find in town was the kind made from regular milk and one of those new seasoning packets with fake buttermilk flavor in it. "How are the kids?" Vanjie asked. "Perry is great. Boys are so sweet." Vanjie smiled. "And that means Trish is less likable all the time. Am I a bad mother for saying that?" "You're a great mother, and it's a stage. She'll grow out of it. Besides, I saw her in town last week, and she was nice to me. It's probably just a girls and mothers thing." In town. Suzanne wondered how she got there. Trish rode the bus to school. Who was she with? A group of kids. Walking? They were getting out of an old truck. One of them wasn't Brendan Lewis, was it? Vanjie nodded. She taught at Buffalo Elementary and thus knew all the kids in town. I believe he may have been the one driving. Why? I overheard her calling him today. He's too old for her. Ooh, yes. He's a very mature boy. Quite the Casanova with the teen set, if the rumors are true. Great. Just what I wanted to hear. A woman's voice interrupted their conversation. Ladies, how are you? Suzanne looked up. The newcomer with the coronet of blonde braids and light blue eyes smiled down at them from her considerable height. Ronnie Harcourt. If Suzanne had to identify a woman who embodied every trait that made Wyoming women so different from her, Ronnie would be the one. And she just happened to live on the neighboring property to the Flints. S-H-I-T, Suzanne spelled in her head. Ronnie was a deputy in training for the Johnson County Sheriff's Office. She roped and branded and, yes, hunted. She also had a habit of showing up every time Suzanne revealed herself as a hopeless Flatlander greenhorn, like putting the wrong foot in the stirrup to mount a horse, getting the truck stuck in a snowdrift, or accidentally pointing a loaded gun in the wrong direction, sending everyone around her to their bellies. Hi, Ronnie. Care to join us? Vanjie asked. Suzanne groaned on the inside. She would be nice, sociable even, because that was how she was raised, but it didn't mean she'd like it. Ronnie declined. I'm picking up a to-go order and heading back to work, but I'm hiking up at Circle Park this afternoon when I get off shift. Anyone care to join me? The leaves should be fantastic. Vanjie looked legitimately disappointed. I wish I could. Circle Park, that was near Hunter Corral, where Suzanne's hunters would be. Out of nowhere, anxiety rolled through her. The faces of her family clicked by one like 35mm slides in the carousel projector of her mind. It felt like a premonition, but vague and unspecific. She didn't believe in premonitions. Patrick did. He encouraged her to listen to her gut, waxing rhapsodically on its connection to the mind and all it could tell her. About the only message she got from hers was when it was time to eat. It was surprising that someone so scientific and rational harbored this mysticism. Maybe it was related to his obsession with what he deemed the supernatural connection of Indians to nature. Suzanne shook her head. I can't, but thanks so much for the invite. The look in Ronnie's eyes said she wasn't fooled. Next time, then. See you later. Suzanne said, Have a nice day. Bye now, Vanjie called after her. Then she leaned over to Suzanne. She's not that bad, you know. I'm sure. Do you really have plans? Because if you don't, you can come with me to Billings to shop. Vanjie made frequent trips to Montana to buy things for the Sibleys Ranch, Piney Bottoms. Montana didn't charge sales tax, so it saved a little money to shop there if you were buying big-ticket items or in bulk. My plan is to get in a bathtub with that new book, Where Are the Children? A bottle of white Zinfandel and candles. The house is quiet, and it's all mine. Notwithstanding her weird sense of unease, she felt a little guilty for how excited she was to have a few days to herself, and for admitting it to Vanjie, who was having so much trouble starting a family of her own. But it was a luxury, and a rare one. Rain check? Rain check, for sure. But be careful. I'm worried about you. About the baby, of course, but she also worried about Vanjie driving alone on the interstate. Don't stop for hitchhikers. There's a murderer loose. He killed a Bighorn deputy. Vanjie's rosebud mouth flew open. Really? That's what the coroner told me just before lunch. Vanjie speared at her salad and waved a bite on the tines of her fork. Best for me to be out doing something, so I don't curl up in a fetal position worrying about this baby. Don't worry. I'm armed and dangerous, and I won't stop for anything. Chapter 6. Evade. Bighorn, Wyoming, September 18th, 1976, 1 p.m. Trish. Trish walked from McDonald's to the horse trailer. Cindy was kicking rhythmically. The horse had a future as a drummer, even though her dad liked to say she was destined for the glue factory if she didn't stop beating up their trailer. Trish petted Goldie's muzzle through an open window in the side of the trailer. The Palomino horse had a nose like the velveteen rabbit. Trish had wanted a black beauty, but she'd fallen in love with her blonde partner, and she liked that their hair matched. Her horse nickered and nudged her, looking for a cookie. Trish didn't have one. "Sorry, girl." Trish got back in the dented white truck. Her dad already had it started and in gear. She was still a little flustered by the call she'd made from the payphone. She'd had Mrs. Lewis take a message about the change of plans from Hunter Corral to Walker Prairie after the grumpy woman had told her Brendan wasn't there and started to hang up. Trish hoped he wasn't already on his way to Hunter Corral to see her, and that Mrs. Lewis delivered her message. Perry and her dad were talking about the Dallas Cowboys' chances for the Super Bowl that season. They loved the Cowboys. It was like if you grew up in Texas, you had to root for them, unless maybe you were an Oilers fan in Houston. Here, people cheered for the Denver Broncos. Trish had decided that since she was a Wyoming girl now, they were her team. Her dad turned out of the parking lot toward the mountains, away from the interstate. Again, he was going the opposite direction from what she expected. "Dad, what are you doing?" Perry was still droning on. "Roger Staubach is a shoo-in for the Hall of Fame." Her dad smiled at her. "We're taking a shortcut." He pointed. "See that dirt road up the face of the mountain?" She squinted. She saw one, barely. "Yeah." "That will shave an hour off our drive." She remembered a heaping handful of times her dad's shortcuts had ended badly, getting stuck, dead ends, broken down vehicles, getting lost. "Great." Patrick went back to the football conversation with Perry. A stodgy voice replaced the music on the radio station with an update on a search for some fugitive. Trish rotated the tuning dial, scrolling through the few stations, all staticky, available in northern Wyoming. They passed a city limit sign for the town of Bighorn. Trish had never heard of it. Since they were through it in less than a minute, she understood why. It was even smaller than Buffalo. She was convinced there were fewer people in the whole state of Wyoming than in Irving, the town in the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex where they'd lived before moving to the real cowboy state. Slowly, the scenery drew Trish in, and she left the radio on a gospel station without realizing it. Deer, antelope, and turkeys roamed everywhere. The road took them next to a meandering creek, its banks thick with aspens and cottonwoods. She rolled the windows down. A hint of the sweet scent of Russian olive trees still lingered in the air when she sniffed hard, the last trace of summer. In the distance, the mountains rose steeply, their sides crowded with tall pine trees, save for the enormous rock formations in a variety of hues: pink, red, black, white, gray. The warm wind whipped through her hair, but she felt a crispness running through it that announced autumn. Snow would be coming soon. Her mom always said Trish was just like her dad. Trish didn't see it. Her dad was a hard-ass and wanted everything his way. But she did love the mountains like he did, so there was that. And horses. She really, really loved horses. "Beautiful, isn't it?" her dad said. She kept her gaze out the window. "Uh-huh." A memory surfaced. Her mom had asked Trish to pass along a message for her dad to call the coroner. She'd tell him about it later. She wasn't through punishing him for bringing her on this dumb hunting trip. He needed to believe in her misery. But she didn't stop admiring the scenery, and when she glanced at her dad, she saw that he was smiling at her, not fooled at all. The tires bounced from pavement to a dirt road. The incline pitched upward. The frame vibrated, the engine whined, and the cab noise grew louder. "Have you ever been on this road?" Trish asked. "Is it even safe?" Her dad's lips started moving with no sound coming out. That gave her the answer. No. The truck crested a hill, then a tire hit a rock. There was a pop. Then the entire truck lurched to the right, which was the uphill side, luckily. A noise started. Bubbada, 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 bubbada. Patrick's eyes cut to his side view mirror, and he pulled over on the flattish section. "Shit." Then, "Don't tell your mom I said that." "What is it?" Trish asked. "Flat tire on the trailer. I think the horses may be kind of heavy for this rough road." He put the truck in park and turned off the engine. "Okay, kids, this is where things get exciting." Perry leaned over the back seat eagerly. "What is it?" Trish crossed her arms. "I've heard this road gets pretty steep, and it's not going to get any smoother. I want you guys to saddle up your horses and ride to the top, ponying the other two. That'll take the weight off the truck and the tires. I don't have another spare." "So it's not safe. Are you serious?" Trish asked. Her mom would not be happy when she heard about this. "As a heart attack." "Cool," Perry said. He was already clambering out the door. Trish followed him, shaking her head. Another story to add to her dad's shortcuts legend. When they had the horses out of the trailer, she said, "How far is it to the top?" "Not far, a few miles." That wasn't too bad. She saddled Goldie. Patrick helped Perry with Duke, his paint horse. Duke was tall and a notorious belly bloater. He sucked in gut-enlarging gulps of air every time someone came at him with a stomach cinch, which made it hard to get the strap tight enough. Trish was mounted and had Reno, her dad's giant black Percheron cross, and Cindy, a short, stocky sorrel, ready before Perry was in the saddle. In addition to being short, he bounced from one task to another like a rubber ball, so it took him forever to do anything. Finally, he was on board. Patrick said, "I'll just change the tire. You guys go ahead." "Okay," Trish responded. Perry took Cindy's lead from her and clucked to Duke. Trish patted Goldie's neck, then shifted forward, tightening her legs slightly around her horse. The 6 of them, Trish, Perry, and the 4 horses, ambled off. Not 20 minutes later, their father waved as he pulled the truck and trailer around them and started creeping up the mountain, faster than the horses, but still quite slow. He disappeared through an S-curve, and then she and Perry were alone. Trish drank in the view. Every time there was a break in the trees on their downhill side, she could see across the foothills and deep into the buttes, the color of red bricks. For a few minutes, Perry didn't say a word. Bird song and the screams of eagles were the only sounds besides the clatter of hooves on the roadbed. But it didn't last. Perry trotted Duke and Cindy to pull even with her. "Who did you call at McDonald's?" "Zip it." "Was it a boy?" Trish didn't answer. "Was it Brendan Lewis?" "What?" Trish whirled on him. "None of your beeswax." "You like him." "You're a brat." She increased her leg pressure on Goldie. The horse responded with a slow trot. Reno resisted. The line grew taut. Trish shook her head. Reno was a stubborn beast. Goldie leaned into it, and Reno gave up, although the line never went slack. Perry shouted, "Wait!" Behind them, a roar of engines approached. Trish moved her horses all the way to the right side of the road, against the mountain face. She didn't look behind her, knowing that would create a chain reaction with Goldie and Reno, and that they'd veer back into the road. "Scoot over, Perry." If he answered, she couldn't hear him. A minute or so later, 2 motorcycles pulled up beside her. The bikes were big and black with silver chrome. They had banana-shaped seats that made the riders lean back. The men wore jeans with leather chaps, leather vests, and bandanas around their foreheads. Both of them had long, wispy beards and mustaches. One had a ponytail. The other had a weird flat top like Perry's. The ponytailed guy, who was shirtless under his vest, whooped when he saw her. Trish tried to unsee his armpit hair. Gross. He braked in front of her and turned his motorcycle crossways across the road. The other man did the same. The horses stopped short. "Yo, pretty little thing, who's this you got with ya?" The ponytailed man thumbed towards Perry. Shocked, Trish stared straight ahead and guided Goldie around the bikes. His accent wasn't local, which made sense because no one from Wyoming would act that way. But she couldn't place it. Not Texan, Northern, Southern, or East Coast like Boston or New York. "Don't be stuck up just because you're good-looking." Perry's voice, when he spoke, was so high-pitched he sounded like one of the chipmunks. "Leave my sister alone." The men looked at each other and busted out laughing. The man with the flat top said, "Her hero, that's a good one." "What are you going to do if we don't, runt?" The ponytailer slitted his eyes at Perry. "Come on, Perry. Trish said. "Ignore them." "Where you headed, sugar? Maybe we'll see you later." Again, she didn't answer them. Perry was having trouble getting Duke past the motorcycles. "Smack him on the butt. He needs to know you're the boss," she told her brother. Perry did as she suggested, and Duke snorted and trotted forward with Cindy, past Trish, Goldie, and Reno. "I like her attitude," the flat-topped man said. The men started their engines, revving them as they pulled around Trish, Perry, and the horses, but not stopping. The muffler backfired on one of the bikes. Duke shied hard to the left. Perry grabbed his saddle horn. Some people were naturals with horses. He wasn't. His body lurched and tilted, but he hung on. Goldie tossed her head, snorting. The motorcycles disappeared into the distance. Trish heaved a sigh of relief. Chapter 7. Churn. Bighorn National Forest, Wyoming, September 18th, 1976, 2 p.m. Perry. Riding up the steep road, with a major drop-off to his left and a nearly straight-up hill to his right, Perry's heartbeat wouldn't slow down. He wasn't usually scared of heights, but he felt like a giant magnet was pulling him toward the edge. Duke and Cindy weren't making it any easier. He couldn't get them to stay away from it. Duke had nearly jumped over the side when the men on the motorcycles drove off, revving their engines, and one backfiring. Those men had looked at his sister in a bad way. He was so mad. Mad like he'd been the time Judd, a bully at his school, had called him a weaselly little girl. Perry had windmilled his fists at him, and Judd had laughed in his face, catching Perry's wrists and not even bothering to punch him. Judd's face was replaced now by the tobacco-stained teeth of Ponytail and the beady eyes of Flat Top, his laugh by their voices. They hadn't taken him seriously either. There had been nothing Perry could do to protect Trish. He couldn't even get his dumb horse to make a getaway without her help. "Why does everyone treat me like a baby?" Tears burned his eyes, and he was glad he was behind his sister. He didn't wipe them away, just let them dry in the Wyoming wind. He wanted to be bigger and stronger. Yesterday. The quiet was heavy, broken only by the hoof clumping, heavy breathing, and occasional lip-sputtering sighs of the horses. His mouth felt like it was stuffed with marshmallows. He couldn't even say to Trish what he wanted to. That he was sorry he had been no help. Sorry and scared. Did she feel the same way? Was that why she wasn't saying anything to him either? He just hoped the two men wouldn't come back. A top-heavy truck wobbled its way down the road toward them. Duke's ears pricked forward, and his head went up. As it drew closer, Perry could see that it had a wooden deck on top of the cab, with a vertical rail fence around it. The tiny paws, pointed nose, and gently flopping ears of a wiener dog peeked over the front of the deck fence, beside a St. Bernard so enormous it seemed impossible he wouldn't capsize the truck. A driver with bushy black facial hair lifted 2 fingers in greeting as he passed. Perry gaped at the vehicle. The top deck matched a larger deck on the truck's flatbed, although the fence around it was a more traditional split rail. Behind the truck was an ancient horse trailer with no roof. A horse spotted like a Dalmatian whinnied at Duke. Duke snorted. Trish put a hand on the back of her saddle and turned all the way around to watch the truck. "Only in Wyoming." Perry nodded. The funny truck made him feel a little better. People in Wyoming were definitely different than back in Texas. Finally, he saw his dad's truck and trailer up ahead. When he and Trish reached it, they found their dad reading maps spread out across the hood. "Took you long enough." Patrick smiled and started folding the maps. "Ready to load up?" Trish said, "Did you see the motorcycles?" "I did, Harleys. You don't see many of those up in the mountains." Perry squeaked. "Those guys were assholes. They were bothering Trish." Patrick froze as he was stuffing the maps into his waistband. "What?" "They were all talk." Trish dismounted. Patrick took Duke's reins. Perry hopped to the ground. "They scared Duke." He didn't mention how much they'd scared him. "Did you talk to them?" Patrick's eyes bored into Perry's, knowing well which of his kids was more likely to cough up information. No, but they wanted to know where we were going. Did you tell them? No. Okay. They walked to the back of the trailer. The three of them were silent as they put up the tack and saddles and loaded the horses. Perry's fear started to shrink. Just being around his dad helped. He looked around. He hadn't seen the mountains from this side before. The view of this peak, close in, made him feel hollow. From the Buffalo side, Cloud Peak was the biggest. From this angle, an angry-looking black-toothed peak seemed like it was. They got in the truck, and Patrick started driving slowly along Red Grade Road. Trish said, "This reminds me of the Swiss Alps in Heidi." "Huh?" Perry said. "You know, the book Heidi?" Perry looked out the window. Trish loved to read. He hated it. The conversation stopped, but he didn't mind. For half an hour his mind floated from thoughts of football to fishing and elk hunting, and then to nothing at all, as they passed bogs, moose grazing on water plants, streams, wide-open parks with brown grass, and the occasional cabin. Perry must have fallen asleep, because he woke up when Patrick turned right onto a forest road across from a creek. "We'll park near here and pack in to camp." Patrick cranked the window down on his side. Trish left hers up, but Perry rolled both down in the back seat. They drove by a truck and travel trailer with Harley motorcycles parked outside. The trailer windows and doors were blacked out with something taped from the inside. "Those are the same motorcycles." Perry wrinkled his nose. "Something smells funny." Patrick tilted his nose toward his open window. "Like ammonia." Trish shuddered. "They're in there. Let's camp far away from them." Patrick nodded. "The place Henry recommended is a long way off." A mile later, Patrick parked the truck and trailer. Cindy, as always, was kicking the trailer. Patrick banged on the side. "Stop that, or you're dog food." "Dad, she can't help it. She's nervous." Perry reached in and stroked Cindy's neck. "More like she's impatient." He smiled at his son. "You won't really sell her for dog food, will you?" "Probably not." "Dad, promise." Patrick scrubbed Perry's crew cut. "I promise. Even though she's annoying, I won't sell her for dog food." Cindy kept kicking until the back doors were open. Getting the horses ready took longer than it had on Red Grade. Cindy wore a pack saddle with the archery equipment attached to it, plus she and the other horses carried saddlebags stuffed full of gear, grub, and garments. But not all the garments. Patrick made Trish leave half of hers in the back floorboard of the truck. Perry watched as his dad checked his .357 Magnum and sheath knife, then loaded them in their holster and scabbard on his hip. "If we're bow hunting, how come you're bringing all the other weapons?" "The revolver is for self-defense, but the sheath knife isn't to use as a weapon. It's for field dressing our elk." Patrick withdrew his sawbones pocket knife from his pocket. "And this is my utility knife." Perry reached for the pocket knife and examined it while his dad loaded the ammo into one of Cindy's saddlebags. The .38 special ammo, because it was cheaper than the .357 caliber. His dad liked things cheap. "Can I carry it?" Patrick rubbed Perry's head. "This one's man-sized. Maybe Santa will bring you one for Christmas." "There is no Santa, Dad." "I wouldn't say that out loud. He might hear you." Patrick winked. He walked over and locked the truck, then reached up to zip the keys into an outer pocket on one of Reno's bags. Reno looked mean, but he was really nice. His dad loved that horse. His friend Henry gave him grief about riding a draft horse in fast-footed cow-pony country, so his dad had taken Reno in for cutting lessons. Now he bragged that he had the slowest cutting horse in the West. "Everyone ready?" Patrick said, sounding jolly. "To go home," Trish said. "So's Goldie. You put too much on her." But Trish mounted up. "Not nearly as much as she'd be carrying if I'd let you bring all the junk in your bag." Perry said, "I'm ready, Dad." Patrick stood beside Duke and put a hand out. Perry used it as a step to get on Duke. Then Patrick hefted himself onto Reno's back and took Cindy's line. He led the way. Perry followed, and Trish brought up the rear. They passed other trucks and trailers parked along the road, and even some people camped in tents. People were loading and unloading, stringing bows, and cooking out. Everyone waved. The horses waddled more than walked with their bulky loads. It was nearly an hour before Patrick told Perry to start scouting for the perfect campsite. Perry was sick of riding, but he took his time. After rejecting a few spots, too rocky, too small, no fire ring, he stopped Duke by a generous clearing in the trees, set back from the trail, with good grass and a well-established fire ring. "How about this one, Dad?" Trish rolled Goldie to the fire ring. "It's still smoldering. Looks like someone was burning trash." Patrick shook his head. His face was grim and disgusted. "Good way to start a forest fire, and this is exactly the wrong time of year for that. The whole mountain is dry as kindling." "There's good grass left and a high line to tie the horses." Perry saw tips of branches littering the edges of the clearing. "Why are all the little tree pieces on the ground?" Patrick said, "Most likely squirrels. They bite off the new growth, then feed off the buds from the comfort of the forest floor." He swung his leg high to clear the saddlebags. He kicked one anyway. Reno sidestepped. Patrick levered himself off into the ground. "This is our spot, then. Good pick, Perry." Perry sighed. He slithered off Duke, suddenly tired, like he'd just played forward both halves of a soccer game. "Look alive, kids. Daylight's wasting and there's a camp to be set up." Perry sighed again, this time louder. "I'll take care of the horses." Trish was already unsaddling Goldie. The mare looked back at her, and Trish stroked her muzzle. "It's you and me on the tent, then." Patrick ruffled Perry's hair. Perry ducked out from under his hand. He wished his dad would stop doing that. Trish smirked. "Sucks to be you, Squirt." He gave Trish the middle finger behind his dad's back, and she puckered her lips and smacked her hand on her butt. Half an hour later, the horses were watered from a nearby stream and turned out in hobbles to graze. The tent was secure, and sleeping bags unrolled inside, on a patch of mostly flat ground without too many rocks. The mountains were blocking most of the sun, even though it was still high in the sky. Patrick hoisted the saddlebags holding the food high into a tree on the far edge of the campsite. "If we eat a late dinner, we have time to get the lay of the land for our hunt tomorrow." His dad's words electrified Perry. Tiredness was just a memory. His first year to be old enough to hunt legally. He'd shot plenty of varmints with his pellet gun, and his dad had lined up and let him pull the rifle trigger on deer hunts, but this was different. He'd be choosing his own animals and shots, operating the compound bow by himself, and claiming his own trophy, if he got an elk, that is. He'd been practicing with the bow all summer, and had gotten to be a really good shot, but his dad always reminded him that a moving animal was different than a target. His thoughts were cut short by a bullwhip voice from the trail. "This is our camp." The voice belonged to a tall, burly man with sunken cheeks above a wispy beard. His hair was sort of black and sort of grayish-white. He was dressed in camo overalls with a black T-shirt under them, the same color as his horse. Perry hadn't even heard him ride up, and he felt sorry for the horse, having to carry someone that heavy. Belatedly, Goldie, Duke, Cindy, and Reno started whinnying and snorting. Perry guessed that was why there was no such thing as a watch horse. He wished they'd brought Ferdinand. He barked at everything, but that's exactly why his dad had said no dogs on a hunting trip. But this was his campsite. He'd picked it out. He puffed out his chest. "It's ours." Patrick held a hand up toward Perry, pushing his palm down, telling him to be quiet. "Good afternoon. Is there a problem?" Perry and Trish shared a look. Her eyes said, "What the heck?" And he knew his did, too. 2 more horses and riders came around the bend in the trail. These riders were enough like the first guy to be family. Swarthy, tall, one old like him, but thin and with completely white hair. Another one that looked young enough to be in high school. The old guy picked his teeth and grinned. The young guy had his face down and turned away from the campsite. The first guy repeated himself. "This is our camp. Always has been. All season long." Patrick shook his head. "There was nothing here when we found it. Did you reserve it?" The 2 older riders guffawed. The young one didn't react. First guy said, "That's funny. A reservation for backcountry dispersed camping. You're a comedian?" "No, I'm a doctor." The teenage boy shifted in his saddle. Maybe he could look at Blue's leg. The guy with the white hair was on a blue roan with a big cut gaping on its back leg. Patrick smiled. Well, I did see a horse with a broken leg last night at the hospital, but I warn you, I'm no vet. No. The bullwhip voice of first guy, again. He stared at Patrick, the look in his eyes, weird. Perry didn't know what to make of that look. Most people act pretty impressed that his dad is a doctor. They line up to talk to him at church, holding out disgusting, rashy arms and bare feet with ingrown toenails. This guy didn't seem impressed at all. First guy said, "All we need from you is our campsite." "Are you serious?" Patrick asked. This time, his voice rose. Perry and Trish moved closer to their dad. Reno started tossing his head and pawing the ground. "I am." "There's a really good spot just up the trail," Trish said. "Better than this one. I saw it when we were watering the horses. Nearer the stream. Bigger." The man grunted. "Then you can take it." Perry saw his dad glance at the tent. The bow was propped against a tree beside it, and his revolver was in its holster belt, hanging over a limb on the tree. "We won't be moving," Patrick said quietly. "Best you move along." His tone raised the hair on Perry's arms. His dad always gets quieter when he's mad. The men shifted in their saddles, and Whitehair watched their leader, first guy, who spit a stream of brown tobacco juice. It splattered where it hit the hard-packed ground on the trail. Motorbike engines tore into the uncomfortable silence as the machines careened around the bend in the trail. Not the roaring street bikes like the Harleys Perry had seen earlier, but dirt bikes. Cool bikes, one red, one yellow, that looked pretty new. Two men with shaved heads rode up, their faces almost covered by goggles. They didn't have on helmets, like the Harley guys, Perry realized. His dad said this had something to do with the law of natural selection and Darwin's somebody or other. The dirt bike riders let off their throttles as they passed the horses. They must have realized something wasn't right, because the one in front stopped and cut his engine. The other rode past him and stopped, too. "Hey, man, is everything good?" First guy said, "Peachy." Perry's stomach hurt all of a sudden, and he moved another step closer to his dad. The dirt bike guys nodded. They started their bikes, kicking down with their right legs, and took off. "I hope this campsite is worth it," first guy said to his dad. "Worth what?" Patrick put his hands on his hips. First guy clucked to his horse, and the glossy animal tossed its head, then swayed forward under the heavy load. The other two fell in behind them and trotted to keep up. Perry didn't know what first guy meant, but he was pretty sure it wasn't good. Chapter 8. Float. Buffalo, Wyoming, September 18th, 1976, 5 p.m. Suzanne. Suzanne laid her head back in the scented bubbles. Magnolia. It reminded her of home, and she breathed it in. The water in the tub was perfect, near scalding. Patrick had adjusted the hot water heater when they moved in. He had to turn the faucets halfway to cold when he showered, just to be able to stand the temperature, but he said he didn't mind. That was the way it was with everything between them. She liked spicy Mexican food. He wanted his salsa mild and couldn't tolerate jalapenos. Steaming baths were one of her favorite things. He took cool showers. She loved hot, humid Texas summers. He preferred the brisk Wyoming fall. Opposites attract, and in their case, opposites thrived. Because they had thrived. She was a blessed woman, she knew. She reached for her glass on the lip of the mustard-colored tub and took a tiny sip of her white Zinfandel. The water sloshed, jostling the white crests of foam. Crocodile Rock came on the radio, and she smiled. Just last week, Patrick had danced her around the living room to this song. It was a happy memory. Even Trish had laughed and danced with her little brother. How could Suzanne have ever dreamed that the boy she'd had a crush on as little more than a girl would turn out to be kind, strong, and loyal? A good father, a wonderful provider. Her life the envy of other women. When they eloped to Mexico while she was still in high school, they'd kept their marriage secret until she'd gotten pregnant. So much for condoms. They should put pictures of babies on the packaging, as reliable as it had been at preventing pregnancy. Her parents had feared the worst. Patrick's wild streak back then, his temper, alcohol, his smart mouth, fighting. They'd wanted better for her, but in the end, he'd won them all over with the man he'd become. If she could change only one thing, it would be his yearning for the mountains. If she could change a second, it would be that he always had to have things his way. But she'd settle for changing one. Crocodile Rock ended on the radio, and the weather report came on. The DJ, she couldn't remember his name, but his son was in Perry's class at the elementary school, did all the announcements. She listened, her head lolled back, her eyes vacantly on the popcorn ceiling. At lower elevations, we're still enjoying the warm, clear days and cool nights of the fall season. Tomorrow's high is expected to be 91 in Buffalo, 89 in Story, and 92 in Sheridan. However, above 7,000 feet, the weather is changing. Thunderstorms and even some hail are expected starting tonight and for the next few days. Hunters, take cover. His voice was deep and gravelly, as if Wolfman Jack was doing their local radio. In other news, law enforcement officers continue their search for Billy Kamecki, who escaped in a Bighorn County vehicle while being transported to the state penitentiary in Rawlins, killing Deputy Robert Hayes in the process. Deputy Hayes is survived by his wife and son. Kamecki was convicted earlier this year of murdering Game and Fish Warden Gil Hendrickson. Kamecki is considered armed and dangerous. Kamecki is a white man, 42 years of age, 5 feet 10 inches tall, 165 pounds, with black hair going gray and dark eyes. He was last seen wearing orange prison coveralls and is expected to be driving a white truck that says Bighorn County Sheriff on the side. Kamecki has family in the Buffalo area. If you see Kamecki, contact law enforcement immediately. He is considered armed and dangerous. Seconds later, Spiders and Snakes came on. Suzanne twisted the dial to off. They hadn't found the fugitive. She wondered who his family was in the area. The unease she'd felt earlier returned in full force. She'd locked the doors before she got in the tub, but she hadn't checked the locks on the windows. Her wineglass had a few sips left in it, so she tipped it back and drained it. The water was still hot and the bubbles still high in the tub, but she pulled the stopper out anyway. Her velour robe was hanging on a hook on the back of the door. She snatched it and wrapped it around her tight and fast, then made the rounds of all the windows. She did the ground level last. Everything was secure until she tried the window in Trish's room. It opened silently and easily when she tested it. When that girl got home, she was in big trouble. Maybe she'd only left it that way after opening it to let in cool air. Their house didn't have air conditioning. Or maybe she was sneaking out at night. Either way, leaving her windows unlocked was not acceptable. She went upstairs and opened the back door. "Ferdy?" The huge silver dog liked the higher elevation of their backyard and usually could be found there, nose to the wind, unless Trish was home. Then he curled up outside her window. It took a few seconds, but Suzanne spotted him, his shaggy ears flapping as he ran toward her, his long tail curled up and behind him like the string to an invisible kite. "Good boy." Ferdinand woofed as he slid to a stop at the back door. Burrs clung to his wiry hair, as did the distinctive odor of horse manure to his breath. Yuck. She pushed him away as he tried to lick her foot. "How about a snack, Ferdy?" She held the door for him, and the dog shot her a questioning look, as if to say, "Don't you always tell me that big dirty dogs aren't allowed in the house?" She usually tied him up outside and took a brush to his hair several times a day. She did, not Patrick or the kids. He was their dog, yet somehow she was the one who fed him, brushed him, and cleaned up after him. "It's okay, boy. Come on in." Rules are made to be broken, especially when killers are on the loose. Ferdy stepped tentatively over the threshold, testing her offer. Then when she opened the refrigerator and came back unwrapping a bowl of stew, he threw caution to the wind. He lifted his nose, sniffing as he trotted over. Suzanne put the bowl on the floor, and Ferdy skidded to it and dove in. She locked the back door. Out the picture window, she saw storms gathering over the mountains. It wasn't a great night for cooking over a roaring campfire. Had she made sure Patrick had enough ready-to-eat food packed? Honestly, She'd been too wrapped up in her own need not to ride, hike, camp, and hunt. Well, they weren't that far away. She could be at their Hunter Corral campsite in half an hour, house door to tent flap. A tingling started deep inside her, the kind she got when she was happy. She'd told Patrick she wouldn't go on the trip, but she hadn't said she wouldn't visit. Moving quickly, she packed up. Summer sausage, cheese, crackers, apples, the rest of her bottle of white Zinfandel, and some plastic glasses. The kids had conned her into buying Halloween candy already, so she added a bag of Hershey's Kisses. She donned the clothes she'd shed onto the bathroom floor and grabbed a rain slicker along with her brown paper bag of picnic items. Ferdinand followed her to the front door downstairs. "Nope, you stay here." She wanted to know she was alone when she came back in the house, except for this big dog. She flicked on the outside lights. During the short walk from her bronze station wagon to the house door, she pictured herself returning after dark, exposed to the night and anyone who might be out there as she unlocked it. But that was silly. The house was on the high prairie. There was nowhere to hide except one meager Russian olive tree 30 feet away, unless you counted the sagebrush that started growing 20 feet from the side of the house. Not exactly great cover for a bad guy. And if she left Ferdinand out and a deer or a fox ran by, the fickle dog would go off hunting, and the house would be left unguarded, inside and out. Yes, keeping him in was the way to go. Suzanne drove through town and west on Highway 16. The city of Buffalo touted the road on billboards to tourists as the safest route to Yellowstone National Park from the northeast. It followed the path of Clear Creek up into the mountains, climbing gradually instead of making an aggressive ascent up the face like the other roads into the Bighorn National Forest from the north. Still, 16 was nothing to trifle with, and there were runaway truck ramps at strategic locations all along the descent. During his first year at the hospital in Buffalo, Patrick had been called out when an 18-wheeler plunged from the road into the creek bed hundreds of feet below. The impact had driven the nails from the driver's boots all the way to his knees. That introduction to the mountains had made an impact on Suzanne. She drove carefully, probably more carefully than she needed to, barely paying attention to the immense ancient rock formations that drew geologists from around the world. Less than 10 miles from town, she turned off 16, heading north onto a dirt road toward Paradise Ranch and Hunter Corral. The location was popular with locals and tourists alike because of its access to Cloud Peak Wilderness and the fact that it was so near Buffalo. The established corrals, campsites with fire pits and picnic tables, trailer parking, pumped water, and Forest Service bathrooms were a plus. She drove through a grove of aspens near the creek. After she emerged from it, a prairie ridge towered to the right, fronted by dramatic rock outcroppings. On her left, the high prairie gave way to forests, creeks, lakes, and the towering peaks of the range. Cloud Peak, with its superior height, lorded it over the others from the center. All told, when she arrived at Hunter Corral, it had been less than an hour since she had gotten out of the bathtub, despite the dramatic change in elevation and scenery. The parking area was jam-packed. She drove slowly around the road that looped through the sites, checking each one as she scanned for their white truck and red trailer. Every now and then, she would flit her eyes back to the center of the loop where the water and the restrooms were. Camping with horses meant a lot of shoveling poop, carrying hay, and hauling tubs of water. But after making one complete circuit, she still hadn't spotted Patrick and the kids. The anxiety that had started at the Busy Bee Cafe and never quite left her intensified. She retraced her path with her windows down. Campfire smoke and the surprisingly sweet scent of horse manure filled the cab. This time around, she noticed a white placard that said Flint on one of the numbered campsite markers. This was both strange and not. She'd made their reservation here, so she'd expected to see it. But what she hadn't expected was that the vehicle parked in the site wouldn't be theirs. She idled behind the unfamiliar blue Ram truck. Then she remembered that each campground area had a host at the edge of the grounds. She drove onward until she reached the last spot, where a trailer with a semi-permanent feel was set up. Sure enough, there was a small placard on the site marker identifying it as the location of the host. She parked and walked to the trailer. Softly at first, then harder, she knocked on the metal edge of the screen door. It rattled against the frame. "Excuse me." A plump woman in a pink gingham applique apron appeared, wiping her hands on the skirt. "Can I help you?" "Hello. I hope so. I'm looking for my husband and kids. His name is Patrick Flint. We had a reservation, but there seems to be someone in our spot." The woman's brows furrowed. "Randy, we've got someone here asking about Site 36. The trailer rocked as Randy walked its length. Where the woman was plump, he was positively round. He was holding a chicken leg between a thumb and forefinger, and barbecue sauce dotted his chin. "Sorry, are you Mrs. Flint?" "Yes, Suzanne Flint." He nodded, then wiped his bare forearm across his mouth, smearing the sauce on his chin. "We let the site go when no one showed up by check-in time. There's a long list of folks wanting to use it this weekend. I'm afraid we're all filled up." Suzanne rocked back on her heels. "How could that be? My husband and kids should have gotten here hours ago, around noon." He cocked his head. "Did you check all the sites real good for them? Sometimes people use the wrong spot by accident." "I did. They're not here." He looked off over her shoulder to the right. "Well, ma'am, I don't know what to tell you. They probably found someplace else where they'd rather camp. But if you're worried about them, let the Johnson County Sheriff know and report it to the Forest Service offices in Buffalo." Suzanne stared at him. His gaze shifted to her, then softened. "I'm sure they're fine. It's a big wilderness. Lots of places to camp." A big wilderness, indeed. Exactly what she worried about. She nodded. "Thank you for your assistance." But as she walked back to the station wagon, she pressed her fist against her mouth. It was one thing simply to be apart for a long weekend, but another altogether to have no idea where her family was in the midst of over 1 million inhospitable remote acres. She drove back to the house in a fog of worry. The outside lights weren't on. Did I forget them? Did a bulb burn out? Her stomach clenched like a fist. With Ferdinand inside, she had nothing to keep visitors away from the house, the 4-footed or 2-footed kind. She parked as close as she could get to the front door, sweeping the headlights of the station wagon as best she could to spotlight the area. She didn't see anything, or anyone. She opened the car door. The wind had been picking up, although it wasn't storming, and it was like a damper on the night sounds. Hair blew into her mouth, and she spit it back out. Drawing in a deep breath, she caught a whiff of something unfamiliar, a foul odor. Bear? No, don't be ridiculous. It's nothing. Probably just Ronnie's trash. For a moment, she thought about driving to her neighbor's and asking for an escort into her house, but only for a moment. She wouldn't humiliate herself forever by providing further evidence that she's not cut out for Wyoming. She stuck her keys point out between her fingers like she'd learned to do in Patrick's self-defense lessons, then tucked her purse under her left arm and jumped out. She hip-bumped the car door closed and ran for the house. With no lights and clouds covering the moon, she fumbled for the lock she couldn't see. She pushed her hair out of her face and dropped her purse. Shit. The stench from earlier grew stronger. "Don't move," a man's voice said behind her as an arm slid around her throat like a boa constrictor. Inside the house, she heard Ferdinand growling and clawing at the wood between them. Her keys joined her purse on the ground as she screamed.